Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to Tokyo on Fire. Today is April 30th, and I am Tim Langley. I'm joined by my co-hosts, Michael Cucek and Dr. Nancy Snow. Michael Cucek is adjunct fellow at Temple University, and he's also the adjunct professor at Sophia University. He is the renowned author of the foremost blog on Japanese politics called Shisaku. Dr. Nancy Snow is adjunct fellow at Keio University. She's on an Abe Fellowship where she is writing a book on Japan's national branding. She is also two-time recipient of the prestigious Fulbright Fellowship. Today's burning issue is on the current visit of the Japanese Prime Minister to the United States. Today is day 3 of his 5-day visit. He's currently on his way to Silicon Valley, as I understand it. He just finished speaking to both houses, joint houses of the United States Congress. And lots of issues are tangled up in this. There's lots of national branding issues also tied up with his state visit. And I'd like to begin the discussion with Michael Cucek, asking you what's kind of going on in your world in the context of the Prime Minister's visit to the United States.
Well, I have a lot of friends in American academia, and one of the hot topics in this is the way that Japan is responding to China's Confucian institutes by instituting stipends or even fully endowed professorships for Japanese studies. The Prime Minister just dropped another one during his visit to Boston. It seems to be going to MIT, but he's endowed chairs at Georgetown and also at Columbia University in New York. So this seems to be a new strategy, and I sure hope it works.
How about you, Nancy, in the context of the Prime Minister's visit to the United States? What's going on elsewhere that's somewhat related to it that's grabbing your attention?
Well, I think having Ambassador Kennedy and her son and her husband and the image of Prime Minister Abe and his wife when they were visiting the JFK Library, and he made remarks about how inspiring Kennedy was. That was a good start to the week. And the curious part to me was the news conference that Abe had with Obama, because President Obama had to spend a lot of time at the beginning talking about Baltimore and the riots in Baltimore. So it seemed in a way that it was kind of taking a lot of the wind out of the sails of the Abe's trip. Another feature, too, is Mrs. Abe. I know she went out with Michelle Obama. They visited an elementary school. But I still think that she's kind of the rock star of the two. And I would have liked to have seen her more featured. Now, maybe she is, but it just wasn't coming through in a lot of the press stories I was reading. This seemed to be really about the Prime Minister and about what he was saying or what he was going to say, of course, in Congress, which was the most recent speech that he gave.
Right. Well, the imagery in the Prime Minister's presentation was really striking, and I thought Ambassador Kennedy looked particularly good. She was really shining, and as Ambassador of the United States, he also paid tribute to several of the former ambassadors, very well-known ambassadors to Japan.
Yeah, I love that part, actually, of the speech when he named the Mansfield and Foley, and I thought, wow, we've had some real giants here come as U.S. ambassadors. So it's that was a sign of a very strong alliance, which was the whole point of the speech to Congress.
Well, since our last Tokyo on Fire, there's been a lot of developments, and the current issue that's hitting my radar is an issue that we talked about last week, and it was about the cold water being thrown on open dialogue, open discourse about what's going on in Japanese politics within the Japanese journalistic fraternity. And it looks like the pressure that's been applied on quelling voices of criticism seems to have worked. And the journalist I'm talking about, Mr. Kono, apparently has been slapped around pretty much and has not received very much support from the rest of his fellows in the international press and the local press.
Well, the New York Times, Martin Fackler, is very much involved politically here. Though he's a journalist, he nevertheless takes a very strong stand in his articles. And he wrote about the situation involving the TV Asahi executives and the TV Asahi producers who were confronted with a situation where one of their commentators, Mr. Koga Shigeaki, just went off on the Abe administration in a tirade against it, accusing it of driving him off television on a live broadcast. The executives were asked to appear in the Diet, explain what had happened, because under Japan's press law, you are not allowed to broadcast lies. Okay? So how could he be allowed to make these unfounded accusations? That is, of course, has a tremendous chilling effect on the press, that you could be called into the Diet to deliver testimony. It certainly indicates that the government does not like you. And even though ostensibly it's the Diet, not the cabinet, that's asking you to do this, nevertheless it's clear that the Japanese government is behind all of it. That, Mr. Fackler's article really didn't change anything. Mr. Koga is no longer going to be a commentator. The three producers of the TV show were all, they were not really suspended. They were
retributions have been meted out.
Yeah, they were reprimanded.
Yes.
And the executives of the network have taken a cut in pay for a short amount of time. At the same time, and what's great is that it's all happening when Abe is out of the country, so that he is not the one who's being the enforcer, clearly. It's all being done when he's away. NHK also, the national broadcaster, also reprimanded and punished some of its reporters in its most critical news program. And that news program has been attacked by the government. In this case, it was for a program where there was a fraud committed.
Staging.
There was a staged event. But nevertheless, the general atmosphere, particularly in regards to political commentary, is closing down a lot.
Yes, it is. And, well, for somebody like us who live here, you see on the Japanese news and also in television drama, it's too staged, and everything is pretty much a recipe for creating drama or for pulling emotions out of people, and it does become tiresome and somewhat forced.
Can I just speak to the Martin Fackler piece? Sure. Because I had a problem with the way it was presented. I think the decline of critical voices, what's happening at NHK, it's all a really important issue. The way that Fackler wrote it, though, it came across as inside baseball analysis. In other words, if you're really not quite an expert on all these people and all these, it was all these puzzle pieces. And I thought, what you need is more analysis of the system as a whole. How did we get here, for instance, and more historical analysis. And with NHK, you call it a national broadcaster. It's a public broadcaster. I mean, and the distinction is that the funding, of course, comes from the people. The Diet oversees the budget. The Diet appoints the Board of Governors. So it's sort of muddy, the waters there. But it is modeled after the BBC. And if the BBC were getting these continual charges of being a government broadcaster, then it would lose its credibility. I mean, it has had that charge before, but BBC is still the gold standard. And NHK, if it wants to be the gold standard, needs to make its own case, its own PR case, that it is not part of the government, it is not beholden to the government's interests, it is overseen and monitored, of course, but it really has to be more of a public independent broadcaster.
But it's not going to ever have that as an image as long as a crony of the prime minister is the chairman of the board.
Yes.
Mr. Momii, it was a crucial financial and political supporter of Abe when he was out of power, was part of I believe, the Sakura Club of executives who supported his return to the presidency of the LDP. And as a gift to him and to his mentor, Mr. Kasai Yoshiyuki, who's the head of JR Central, he gave this position of chairman of the board, of the governors, of board of governors of NHK, to Momii. And Momii immediately said things like, at this network, whatever the government says, we will not say anything different from it. If the government says that the Senkaku Islands are inherent Japanese territory, that's the way our announcers are going to describe it. And at that point, the difference between a public broadcaster and a government broadcaster, I'm sorry,
No, you're
it's
right.
lost on me.
But he's making exactly my point. You're putting this in that larger context, and that's what people need to hear more. You're giving the history, how it got to be to this point, and that's what I'd like to see more in terms of these stories, because it's hard to just jump right in and read all these names, and you just don't understand how did we get here? Because Japan really, part of the trip to America is about these two democracies coming together. Big D democracy was a big part of the speech that Abe gave. And 70 years hence from World War II, look at this strong alliance that we have. Well, democratic accountability, free speech, free press, that's all part of it.
Yes, we are in an alliance.
Yeah.
We're an alliance, but the democracy part's getting kind of funky.
Yes, it is.
And that's
Where's Shaka Khan when we need her?
That's right. But in this case, we just got through the unified local elections, which are local, but they're not terribly unified. But the citizen participation was appalling.
Yeah.
It was absolutely rock bottom.
Yes, it was.
Okay?
Missing public.
And there was a missing public. There were missing candidates. 5 city councils did not have enough people running to fill all the seats. All you had to do was show up and register, and you could get a seat on the city council. And they couldn't convince people. This country is an exhausted democracy, where the electorate is it's coming in to the voting booth in ever decreasing numbers. The number of people who are running for office is constantly decreasing. I think 35% of the available seats that were handed out in the local elections were just handed out. They didn't even have an election. They just, whoever showed up became the person who was elected. Abe going to the United States and saying, I represent a democracy. Yeah, but it's a deeply demoralized democracy. And you're in charge of it, Mr. Abe. How come this deeply demoralized electorate is somehow giving you a mandate for change and a mandate for the future?
So
I don't
he needed
see that.
more adjectives, didn't he?
See, that's what happens whenever I bring up a slightly off-topic issue. I think Mr. Koga was right on target when he held up the sign and said, I am not Abe. I don't speak for Abe. I have my own voice. I can say what I want to. I am on a national public television station. My boss was appointed, rightly so, by the Prime Minister. Let's give him that.
Okay, this is on TV Asahi that he did this. So it's a private broadcaster, but under the national broadcast law, the government can really crush you if they want to. And they tried in 93, 94 as well. When TV Asahi, the same network, actually was pretty proud of having overthrown the LDP during that pre-Fender Regnum, and someone made a speech saying, hey, we got him. And when the LDP came back to power, those executives were brought in and said, what do you mean we got them? You know? So it's a repeat offender, first of all, in the
Payback
LDP. And payback.
So bringing in people, that is a contrast to the dinners, the sushi dinners that Prime Minister Abe will have with selected journalists. That was part of Martin Fackler's piece.
Oh, the
Do
press
you remember
clubs,
that?
yes.
Well,
right.
he's actually talking to various
Influential
journalists, and also the executives of all the major organizations, and not just hanging out with Watanabe Tsune or the Yomiuri group, but he brings in the Asahi group, he brings in the Mainichi group, he tries to wine and dine everybody so as to get the top execs and the journalists separated.
Yes.
In terms of management versus the ink-stained wretches. And it's working, seemingly.
It is.
Right.
I would agree with that. And I think, too, I wanted to speak to my friend at Sophia University, your colleague, Koichi Nakano. He's been having a really hard time. He's probably the go-to guy. I'm sort of calling him the Noam Chomsky of Japan now, in that, but it's becoming the Chomsky syndrome, in that he's sort of being singled out as the one sole Japanese critic, Japan-born critic, educated at Princeton with a Princeton PhD. He's got all the credentials. But he is a very strong, outspoken critic of Abe's policies. He's not afraid to talk to any of the media. The problem is that I think that he's being somewhat isolated now, and when you have this situation where you have sort of this one go-to critic being sourced in all the articles, it leads to the wrong conclusion, and that is that we've got this one outlier here.
Right.
When there are a lot of us who can see what's happening and are speaking even on this program about it, but we are not really the ones that reporters are naturally, maybe they don't even realize there are others here, but you want to build up a whole host of voices of criticism if you want any kind of systemic change. Otherwise, I worry that my dear mentor almost here as an academic is going to be exhausted, to use your word that you used earlier, by this process. It weighs on you.
But the thing is that the Gaima show, supposedly unofficially in a private email, members of the Gaima show staff have emailed journalists and say, don't talk to Nakano. Don't quote him. He doesn't represent Japanese. And then when these kind of emails have been circulated amongst non-Japanese journalists and Japanese journalists as well, then they say, oh, I was just speaking in a private capacity, using, of course, my email address at the foreign ministry. This is unprecedented. Never before in Japanese history have we had a situation where members of the diplomatic community have gone after Japanese citizens as being unreliable. I mean, we have the Communist Party here, we have the Socialist Party here. We've never had anybody going and say, don't talk to the communists, they don't speak for Japan. But here, in the case of this of Dr. Nakano, they are going after him in a very, very clear way, which, of course, again, the Abe administration cannot be seen as the iron fist there, because it's being handled by members of the bureaucracy rather than the government.
Well, and then that raises the question of the endowed chairs and their purpose. Because are they going to function as a counterweight to, say, a Nakano effect here?
Right.
And if the government wants to pay for an endowed chair, I don't know many academics who would turn down an endowed chair, but we would feel very strongly that, okay, I am going to speak for myself, I'm going to do my own research, I'm going to come to my own conclusions, and I don't want the government intruding on that. And yet I think that if you want to have your funding, because a lot of times these chairs are 3 years and then they get somebody else in there. So if you want to stay there, maybe it's kind of a gentleman's agreement that we understand each other, that you're not going to get too far outside the box. But as I'm working now on my book on Brand Japan, I mean, increasingly I'm wondering, how far should I go in my criticism, because I can see what's happening here with a lot of pushback. And all of this will have a deleterious effect on Nation Brand Japan in the long run. Maybe it's a win for them short term, but it's not going to work with that nice Japan, let's get more tourists here, or let's get more academics, foreign faculty, foreign students. It's not going to work. You're bringing in young people who are more questioning, and they're going to be questioning in the classroom, and they're going to be wondering, hey, what's going on here in Japan?
I'd like to talk about the national branding aspect, in particular, of the Prime Minister's speech to the U.S. Congress. But I'd first like to ask your opinion. What's your reaction to that speech?
Oh, the speech I thought was, in terms of content, it was really fabulous. I thought the speech was very well written. It could have been delivered a little bit better, but I really liked the speech. It went on for 45 minutes. I think he said a lot of things that took me a little bit by surprise. I was proud of him for saying a lot of the things and for pointing out the contributions of people to the Japan-U.S. relationship.
Right.
And, as somebody who's devoted my life, like you, to that relationship, to living here, to, promoting those kinds of interests, that was really encouraging to me.
And what about the delivery?
Well, again, he had given the speech in Australia. When was that? Last summer, in English, and I think that went over well. And there were moments of this sort of enthusiasm, and the timing was a little off, but he was able to rally. And I think I would agree with Tim that there were references made to the apology for the World War II and the lives that were lost. I was moved by that. I ended up posting something about that. I was thinking about my father, who had served on the USS Missouri 8 months after the Japanese officially surrendered on the Missouri. So it was a wonder to me. I just thought, what an incredible alliance. It really is. Bumps and all. But there were a lot of things left out. Remember, he said at the beginning that I've got a lot to say, and there was sort of a little bit of laughter. But he didn't say everything that he could have said. You had, is it Mike Honda, Representative Honda there with the comfort woman. So
Yes.
you had sort of the drama. And of course you knew, I think we all knew he wasn't going to go there. This was very much targeted to the U.S.-Japan alliance. Interesting time because not many Americans probably viewed this. Now they can watch it later, but you're talking about 11 a.m. Eastern Time, 8 a.m. Pacific. So I'm watching it here at midnight in Tokyo. But I thought it was going to be at night, prime time. And also the networks really didn't carry it. I had CNN on with the sound turned down, and CNN broke in occasionally, and they had reporters talking over Abe giving his speech. So, of course, you look at Netanyahu not too long ago, and all the networks were covering that. So,
And the seats were all full.
yes, indeed, right. But I thought it had many strong parts to it, and even when he was talking about his landlady in California, who said, the widow landlady who said, my husband was better looking than Gary Cooper. Of course, I love that. Having lived in Southern California as long as I did, we always make references to Hollywood. And then, too, when he talked about the U.S. Ending the war and Tokyo's in ruins, and then the U.S. turns around and is sending all this aid, including how many goats?
2036.
I had to tweet about that. I just couldn't help.
2036
Jennifer Lend
goats.
at Dartmouth retweeted I said, goats rule. Who knew? Who knew? And I'm picturing the goats. Were they on a ship coming over here going, wow, this is taking long? But the TPP sort of, there was a lull there. And then he switched to East Asia, Northeast Asia, and that, too, didn't really work. It was kind of like a filler. But I think the strongest part would be, wow, this is an alliance that's really going to stick for the long term. So no question there.
To use a baseball metaphor, it may not have been a home run, but it was a solid base hit. And what we were all worried about was whether he'd strike out.
Yeah.
Yes.
Because that's been the framing that we've been getting a lot of, because there has been a lot of discussion on message boards and in emails. What is the new word for remorse? Until now, the word has been owabi, apology, and that has appeared in the Murayama statement and in the reiteration of the Murayama statement that was done by Prime Minister Koizumi in 2005. So that word owabi disappeared from Abe's statements, most recently the statement that was made at the 60th anniversary of the Bandung Conference, where it had been in Koizumi's speech just 10 years ago. There was a big buildup. What is going to be the word that's used? And it seems to be that the word in Japanese is the word hansei. When Abe gave his speech, the translation in the Japanese, the speech was delivered in English, but the Japanese translation that appears on the Ministry of Foreign Affairs email regarding the speech is 痛切な let's see, 反省, meaning I'm reflecting upon something so much that my brain is hurting. Which I don't know if that's apology. I don't know if that's remorse, but it was first being translated as remorse, and Japanese scholars said that's not what hansei means. It just means reflection. Okay? So that's not true. Suddenly, just before the speech, it's now being translated as repentance. And the reaction is, no, it's still not
right.
repentance.
Yes.
It's just reflection. Stop mistranslating it. But that is going to be a minor story maybe, but it just irks. It just digs at you that you'd take a word whose translation is known and you just twist it and release these phony translations, these phony versions of the speech that, come on.
It irks you.
It irks you,
Yes.
and it undermines eventually the credibility of the Japanese
The branding,
government.
what we're talking about
You know,
over and
I've
over
said
again.
before, you have to move on beyond this, but obviously what he's saying is not working when you have all these scholars then pointing out these discrepancies between the English and the Japanese version. In Boston, he said his heart aches, so it does sound like some kind of medical affliction going on as opposed to an apology. An apology is very much directed at the other, the aggrieved, whereas this sounds it's too self-referential. Like I'm really getting sick over this. And that is not projecting the right tone or I think too what's missing is this sincerity.
It's all very passive.
Yes.
It's not an active voice saying, I apologize for this. It's, oh, these impressions are coming to me.
It is a passive voice, indeed. Right.
Well, I think probably the Prime Minister is thinking, look, why should we apologize? This was done to us. We were building an empire just like everybody else. You cut off our supplies.
Oh, yeah,
you
like he's going to
blockaded
say
us.
that in Washington.
Exactly. You're not going
to
to.
the Hatu House
So-
on Hirohito's birthday.
Exactly. Wasn't that interesting?
Gosh.
April 29th is Hirohito's
I did see an
birthday,
opinion piece
okay?
about that.
Like he's going to say, we really deserved our empire in Asia.
Don't you think there's got to be a psychological explanation for his choice of words? And I think that's because he sincerely believes, what the hell are you talking about? Yes, a lot of people were hurt. A lot of people died. It's kind of nobody's fault. It was just a confluence of situations, and it turns out that we lost and you won, and so you're dictating to us that it was our fault, and I don't buy it.
Well, again, that's sort of victimhood. And I thought it was telling, too, that the first topic he talked about in the speech was grandfather,
Yes.
Kishi. Now, my guy, the Abe Fellowship, Shintaro Abe is never brought up, but that may be your psychology. I've thought before.
But we know this about him. He is very proud. He is very firmly established as a Japanese statesman. He has no apology for that. I mean, he wants Japan to be a proud, rich, just nation, and he wants the Japanese nation to project its influence regionally and globally. And in some sectors, he's successful. And I think he's just trying to broaden that. And his speech mentioned a couple of times, I'm the guy. I'm going to do it. It's on my watch. You wait and see. I've promised it. We have documented it. We're moving forward. Mark my words.
Well, there's your problem, right? Because that makes me think about the Bush years again, when it was Bush being very confident, Bush and Cheney, about we're going to be successful. And the American people tired of that because we really felt like we should have a say in the matter. And when you have that sort of cult of personality, it's just not good, because Japan is so much more than the Prime Minister and the Diet. And again, broken record here, but it's just, where are the voices of the people? That there wasn't a sense in the speech really of kind of the nation of Japan. It was very much about the state. And
The relationship.
Yes.
Yes.
And state-to-state relations and TPP as investors and who's getting rich. But yes, of course, I want a strong Japan too. I want an influential Japan. But in a holistic context, you have to look at the costs and benefits. So how is TPP going to impact us all? Not, let's write a story about TPP and how great this is going to be for people at the top or the companies at the top. And there's too much of that type of coverage going on. So I would have liked to have had some sort of everyday reaction to this that I haven't heard. Maybe you all see on the Japanese TV that I don't watch.
Well, I would prefer that Abe use his tremendous political capital, and he does have tremendous political capital. He has no rivals in the party. He has no rival parties in the Diet that are worth talking about. He has the ability to move Japan beyond the parameters where it's at. That means not just in terms of economy, not in terms of trade, but also in terms of its political position. Wouldn't it be cool if he, as a representative of the conservative wing of his party, says, we did these really bad things in Asia, we're deeply sorry. We recognize we cannot run away from history. And he does say that we cannot run away from history, but he then proceeds to run away from history.
Yes.
That would, in terms of national branding,
Yes.
really change things. Because
I think so.
throughout East Asia, every major power has its humiliation story. And wouldn't it be great if one nation said, we're going to give up that. We're not going to go in, we were injured, we were the ones to become victims. No, we were the victimizers and we're sorry for it. I think that's what the Germans did in Europe, saying, they eventually had their own victim stories come out, but it was a private matter. It was not a government matter. The government faced up to this fact. And I think that the Japanese government, and particularly Mr. Abe, can make this work. Because, let's face it, the history textbooks of Japan may not be the greatest history textbooks, but they're significantly better than the history textbooks of China, where their own government's absolute devastation of the population in various episodes, such as the Cultural Revolution or the 100 Flowers campaign, these things are obviously not dealt with. Wouldn't it be great for Japan to be known as the honest nation, honest about history, and then you have a national brand that says, we're willing to fess up to things.
I like that better than hope, because remember at the very end he talked about this Hope Alliance, and that didn't really wow me, but I like that honest nation because that works well with the nice Japan too. That I can leave my smartphone and go grab my coffee and come back and my smartphone is still there.
Right.
That's one of the traits that people really notice when they're visitors here. Is there's a lot of personal accountability.
Well, I think one of the greatest things about his speech was talking about the alliance. But I think the most emotional part was when he was talking about, the war, about the Pacific War. And I was touched by that. And
Yes.
he came really close. I was surprised, actually, as I was listening to him, that he had gone that far and he had really addressed the issue. And I think he took it about as far as he could have taken it, knowing this prime minister. I wish he could have gone a little bit farther, but I understand his background and his proclivities, and also his constituency here in Japan. They're listening, they're watching too. And although he played to the audience, I think that was one of the high points of his presentation.
I don't know. It seems to me that when you start out a speech talking about your grandfather, who was the Minister of Munitions in the pre-1945 government, and who was in charge of the industrialization of Manchuria, a country that was set up by the Japanese military of Manchukuo, and talk about him first as the first introductory subject, you're signaling that you have an obsession, okay? And it's an unchanging one. During the Bush presidency, when he came and visited, he brought a picture with him of his grandfather, Kishi, playing golf with Dwight Eisenhower and Vannevar Bush, okay, in Washington, D.C. and it was from one, and it gave that to Bush. I'm sorry, but your grandfather did not play golf with Barack's grandfather. Okay,
Right.
you don't have that kind of thing going on, and yet he comes with the same story, the same relationship, and I'm sorry, I'm tired of it. I would personally say, forget about him. I don't have the same name. As she said, I'm an Abe.
And not an Abe.
That's right.
That was
Not
funny.
an Abe. That was right. Yes,
I did once call it Abe.
Yeah,
20 years ago.
Well,
but
honest Abe.
Yes.
Yes, but
I agree.
Yeah.
That was not an impactful beginning at all because, again, very predictable. That's your problem. Surprise me, Abe, which would be what Michael was saying in terms of the apology. Make the apology. Let's all move on. Then. And that would be the surprise because of the messenger. That we have lowered our expectations there. We keep saying, well, he's not going to go that far. So we're just going to have to wait out. Maybe some of these elderly comfort women, for them to, they're in very, very, I imagine, declining health in their late 80s, most of them. So, but it just seems like, I guess if you're the speechwriter or speech writers, there's some things you can control and some things you can't. So that was definitely an Abe
Yes, that's true.
there at the beginning.
Well, the comfort women issue is one of those issues among the many that just won't go away.
Won't go
and
away.
the fellow who first brought it up, a professor in Sapporo, still reports on death threats that he's receiving on a regular basis. You know,
and he's traveling in the U.S. at the same time. That's the thing. He went and spoke, I believe, at the Japan Society in New York and in various universities. He'll be, I think, in California at the same time Abe's in California speaking. So that's scheduling. Okay, so
Yes.
he's offering his alternate narrative of I'm being persecuted,
no, he is.
and he really is.
One of the characteristics of living in Japan is the culture and the overlying culture of if you stick out, if you're the nail that sticks out, we are going to get you. And a lot of these people we were talking about, the journalists as well, you speak out against what is perceived to be conventional wisdom, and you're going to get hammered for that.
And also, you mentioned California. If I were doing the speech writing, I would have begun with his being a young man in California, because I think that's surprising to a lot of people that he had this youth. And he did mention his age again, where he said 20 years ago, I was told that what was he, cheeky, that he had become. And all of that kind of humanizing part was really good. It draws you in as a listener, as a viewer. And so now he's switched into California. It's interesting with a lot of these endowed chairs, they're East Coast, it's elite, Ivy League. So we go to California where we have the opportunity for things to go maybe a little awry in terms of an Asian population that is a lot more Korean and Chinese. And so are you going to have more vocal opposition? That'll be interesting how it's covered by the media there. It's very, very different culturally on the East Coast and West Coast, having lived in both parts. So.
Well, he left for California tonight, I guess. He'll be there for 3 days. I imagine former Ambassador John Roos will be,
Of course,
very
in
much
Silicon Valley,
shepherding him to various meetings and events, venue, that sort of thing.
Now that should be great in Silicon Valley, because I think that'll be all about business, technology, and Japan should be a feature player there. He is going to Los Angeles, though, I thought, too, where you have the Pasadena with the Comfort Women statue, and I just wonder how separated he will be from that. There's a big Japantown part of Japangelist.
And even bigger Korean American.
Yes, much bigger.
And so he's going to be. That's going to be a walk into the lion's den. But I'm sure that he will be, perfectly surrounded by Japanese Americans and by Japanese who live in the United States, who are his fans. He does live very much now in a bubble.
I was just going to say that too.
He's
That's
surrounded
worrisome.
by he's surrounded by a fan group that is of sufficient size that he really does not have to interact with his own citizens or the citizens of other nations that don't agree with his views. And personally, I don't want to talk any more about World War II. I am sick of the whole thing. It's 70 years out. You know, we should be way beyond this. And we had last year the centenary of World War I, and it seemed like, what was World War I about?
Yes.
Well, we should have the same reaction about World War II. We should be saying, okay, yeah, it was the war against Hitler, but we didn't declare war on Hitler, and then the Japanese hit Pearl Harbor, and you know, it's not really clear. And can we get off this moralistic bent?
Yes.
And
I agree with you.
The way Abe wants to get off of it is by letting it die of old age, which is absolutely the wrong way to do it.
Right.
But time is on his side, and supposedly, but he should take a lesson from the other genocide that we're doing this year, which is the Armenian-Turkish genocide. That story, after a century, unlike World War I, which is sort of vague and incomprehensible, that one's still live and it's still hot in Washington. And for Abe to think, I'll just wait the comfort women out, is no. Deal with it. Be the guy. Be the man. Be, you know, the answer to this question posed by his grandfather. Do it, get it done, and then move on.
I hate to say it, but the Kardashians even went to Armenia, so you're right. It is a hot thing. But with the war, I'd love to say yes, put it in a box. But now with the U.S.-Japan Security Alliance, changing the Constitution, updating, this will help you if needed. Then you read the comment sections of stories and people talk about World War III. So wars just never go away, do they? We're in kind of a perpetual war preparation. So even if there's no hot war for us right now, we're anticipating. And he uses the peace and development, and a lot of this is sort of sounds a little like newspeak and just you're preparing with arms buildup and an arms industry for something to happen. You want to put that to service at some point. But I still have this lovely image of the self-defense forces not getting involved in any hot action where people are killed. Let's keep that. And that's going back to a constitution from 1946. If we don't want to go back to 45, can we start with the Japanese Peace Constitution? I've just read the Beate Sirota Gordon piece where she was the woman who put in the whole article about women's equality, and it was a very inspiring story. So the only woman in the room was her autobiography.
But the thing is that the movement for revising the Constitution is ongoing. We had Funada Hajime, one of the rare LDP people who has gone to the Foreign Correspondents Club recently. This week he went there and
spoke very, very clearly and aggressively about
constitutional revision. And he, until he had certain troubles politically, he would have been where Abe is now. He certainly was far above Abe in terms of the hierarchy. But he's in charge of this, and he's using it to burnish his legacy. They're going to do it, no matter what. We also had this week, after, of course, the local elections passed, immediately afterward, the Komeito agreed to everything, basically, that the LDP asked in terms of the defense guidelines. Abe went to the United States with nothing in hand, okay? There's no legislation that's been passed that allowed him really to make these statements and have his Minister of Foreign Affairs and Minister of Defense talk to their counterparts in Washington or in Arlington or in Boston, wherever they were, that here's our deal, here's what we can do together. None of that's been put into legislation, right? He just came with a promise. But we had the Komeito saying, okay, we're all for these things, which means that the legislation is going to pass. The diet session is going to be extended. It's currently supposed to expire in June. No one believes that. People are looking at Obon in August, that they're going to extend the session, pass the many pieces of legislation that need to be passed. About 15 laws need to be amended, but it's going to be done with an omnibus bill. All this is going to be done and put to bed this year, which you got to say it. Abe's making change happen.
The Prime Minister actually kind of indicated that in his presentation as well. You know, that I will do this before, you know, the summer, before this year is out. These things will happen. They will come to pass. But
sounds very authoritarian.
it does.
regime
And
to
there's,
me.
I mean, that's always the fear here, the fear regionally that if you give the Japanese back, you know, the military capabilities, they will reassert that arrogance that they've been criticized for. And
Lee Kuan Yew called it, you know, giving alcohol to an alcoholic, you know, giving military power to the Japanese. We
Yes.
have this effect. I think he would have changed his mind in the last few years of life, but
yes.
yeah.
Well, I mean, all I would say is look at the great example that the U.S. has had with all of our interventions around the world. I mean, things have not exactly gone well for us. We've sort of bankrupted ourselves. So now Abe wants to be in that club? I'm just not quite understanding that, because you have a peace constitution that should be a model to the rest of the world. You know, honest Japan and peaceful Japan. Of course, if all of this gets passed, I will just be the curmudgeon talking about this.
You and Nakano sensei.
Exactly.
Well, he came with two objectives, didn't he? He came with the military alliance objective, and obviously he's got to come with an economic objective. He has to do something to help bring Japan out of the doldrums, and I think that's probably what the California portion is dedicated to.
Well, he's certainly not getting anything out of the BOJ's actions. We are not seeing the 2% growth that was promised when these quantitative easing measures started. We've not seen the inflation rate go up. There are people saying it's not just the price of oil that's causing this deflationary period, that there are real structural problems that are reasserting themselves, and that all the efforts so far to stimulate the economy are going absolutely nowhere. I was surprised that that has not been as much of a conversation piece as it should have been, considering that the big story of the first year in office was Abenomics.
Right,
Yes.
right.
Yeah, that's not on the table. That's not of interest. What we're talking is security, the alliance this week. That to me is indicative, either one, they're losing interest, or two, they're losing confidence.
Well, was he expecting some kind of a trade deal to come out of this?
No, I don't think so. I
Okay.
don't think TPP was. I mean, it was on the agenda.
They tried
Or
to.
the
They
bilateral.
had the last minute until 3:00 meetings here in Tokyo, which ended with a promise to meet again.
Right.
Yeah, but they didn't have anything. That was another non-deliverable. You know, the Abe goes without a TPP final deal.
Well, the expectations were really not there either. That he would go to Washington and close the deal. I mean, it's
Yes, but
Very
he's
difficult.
a good Japanese gentleman, and he should bring an omiyage with him. He should bring his gift. And he didn't bring much except, you know, his wife, which is a very nice person to bring along. And the atmospherics were nice. No major blunders, no major insults.
So what do you
whatever.
think? Was it a good visit? I mean, to Washington, D.C., 3 days. He went to Boston. He went to Washington, D.C.
We'll see how California
The
works out.
state
Right.
dinner, there was reportage in the Washington Post. Robin Given was writing about who went to the dinner.
A lot of
and-
luminaries, right?
Well,
As you'd
yeah,
expect.
it wasn't as A-list maybe as some, but
Hey,
actually,
George Takei was there.
well,
was.
of course, I love George, and I think the Seattle Seahawks quarterback was there.
Seattle Seahawks quarterback, the Ichiro?
No, the
Seattle-
football.
Oh, but he's not Japanese. Why would-
No, I don't
Okay.
know, because they had just had the Washington Correspondents' Dinner. So this is sort of that Hollywood meets Washington thing, and there was they were serving sake, of course,
Yes,
and
From Yamaguchi Prefecture, which
and
is
then
where
Michelle Obama is always so clever because she was wearing the Japanese designer. The purple is really beautiful. So that part I think went very well. And again, I'm seeing this 7,000 miles away, but I just would have liked that the speech maybe were more sort of prime time, because I just think that a lot of people, given what was happening in Baltimore and all that time that Obama was spending on that at their joint news conference, Abe's just standing there as Obama's going on and on about how the peaceful protests devolved into the riots. So it's probably a little perplexing.
Who dictates whether it's on prime time or not? I mean, it's the whole confluence of other situations that are going on.
With the riots, with all the people and the overturned cars, and when you think about the protests here, I was writing yesterday about the man who burned himself
in Shinjuku.
Self-immolation, the end of June last year, right before the announcement of the change to Article 9. Now, that was this one guy, and there were people there with their smartphones, and NHK, if you remember, NHK didn't cover it, but it was sort of like he was there, and then you never heard another thing.
Right.
So, whereas in America, it builds, and things quiet down, and there might be a curfew, but it can go on, and just as it did in Ferguson. So it's a very different way of sort of handling the dissent and the tension internally. You just don't have the masses of protesters here. And when you're talking about all the amendments to the Constitution, it's going to be a long, hot summer with the August 15th.
Yes.
Waiting to hear what he's going to say with his advisors about apology or not.
We got a preamble, we got a taste in this speech.
We did get a taste of it.
And we know pretty much now that he's not going to put the word apology in there. It doesn't matter what his
Well, who knows? He might be listening to Tokyo on Fire.
Right.
But, I mean, I think you'll see a little bit of on-the-fly adjusting. Let's hope we don't see a whole lot of on-the-fly adjusting while he's in California for the next 3 days. But I think there's still a lot of game left in that U.S. trip. What do you think?
I would say in conclusion that it's been a week when, on the domestic front, it's been a bit troubling.
Yes.
The lack of enthusiasm of people in democracy, the pressure that's been put on the press, and that's clearly there. It's not as though that there's an authoritarianism. It's just, as I said earlier, an exhaustion with democracy and democratic procedures. And then we have Abe going as the representative of an Asian democracy to the Congress, the seat of America's democratic processes, which, of course, as we know itself, is frozen solid with antagonistic partisan gridlock. Okay?
Yes.
So, as someone who believes in electoral politics very much and who studies it and looks at it very carefully, I'm really, really torn by this week, because it's not representative to me. It's an representative democracy on both sides of the ocean.
There is gridlock in Washington, but also great restaurants. So just to put a little positive spin on it, I lived in Washington inside the Beltway 9 years. I have never seen it so bad with the political gridlock. But it is an exciting place, though, for a lot of young people to go live right out of college and graduate school. A lot of nonprofits and, of course, all the embassies there. So it's an exciting place. And, of course, that changed during the Kennedy years, to bring it back to Kennedy, because they made Washington really a must place and very elegant with Mrs. Kennedy. So there were some symbolic upticks there, but I think what you're talking about with the maybe the apathy and the passivity, and then the passive voice regarding the inability on Abe's sort of rhetorical part to take a more active role in saying Japan apologizes. Why not just say Japan, and don't make it so much about him, but these speeches are always very interesting to deconstruct. What could you have said?
Well, hopefully, to bring this around full circle, I think one of the central underpinnings of a democracy is a vibrant and independent free press.
Right.
And that's, I think, one of the reasons why we spoke about it at the beginning of this podcast, is that it really is critical and it's central to achieving that level of democracy that I think makes sense. And one of the reasons why foreigners who live in Japan have a bit of a difficulty in kind of getting their head around Japanese democracy is because, yes, it's democratic. They run elections, they have votes, they have representatives in the House of Parliament, but it's just not quite the same. There are a lot of things that are different, and in the United States, boy, don't we wish it was a little bit different there too.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so with that, I'd like to draw today's conversation to a close. You've been listening to Tokyo on Fire. Today is April 30th, 2015. You can send comments to us at comments@tokyoonfire.com or via Twitter at #TokyoOnFire. You can visit us on YouTube and subscribe for more upcoming episodes. Thank you very much. Please post your comments. Please continue to visit us. This is Timothy Langley signing off. See you next week.